Well, Michael A. Gomez is the Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. He's also the director of NYU's Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. Professor Gomez served as the founding director of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, or ASWAD, from its inception in 2000 to 2007. And from 2009 to 2011, Professor Gomez served as the president of UNESCO's International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project. And he's also the series editor of Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora for Cambridge University Press. Professor Gomez is a prolific author. His publications reflect tremendous breadth and time span, ranging from the history of ancient Africa to the history of the African diaspora through the 20th century. And just to name a few of his publications, in 1992, he published Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad, the pre-colonial state of Bundu, which examines a Muslim kingdom in what is now eastern Senegal in the 17th through 19th centuries. Focusing on North America, he authored in 1998, Exchanging Our Country Marks, The Transformation of African Identities in the Colonial and Antebellum South. In 2005, he authored Reversing Sail, A History of the African Diaspora, and in the same year, he published the book Black Crescent, African Muslims in the Americas. His book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, which was published just this year in 2018, has been called brilliant, groundbreaking, and a stunning achievement. In an article in 2004, Michael Gomez reflected on W.E.B. Du Bois's discussion of double consciousness, the two-ness of being American and Negro, as Du Bois pondered this problem in Souls of Black Folks in 1903. Professor Gomez argued that this two-ness is the essence of the African diaspora, not only for Du Bois's time, but for our own. For us, Professor Gomez states, and I quote him, "Africa once lost has yet to be recovered, whereas America as an ideal has yet to become home." And then he goes on to assert, and I quote him again, "As such, it should come as no surprise that the forced geographical displacement of persons would result in an all-out search for a return to equilibrium, to the organization of a social ensemble in which, to the furthest extent possible, wrongs are righted, wounds are healed, and dignity is restored." Michael Gomez has dedicated his life's work to recovering the story of the African past, to righting the many wrongs of misinformation that dominated historical interpretations and popular opinion, and to restoring dignity and pride of heritage to all persons of African descent wherever they are in this world. It's a great honor for me to bring to you my friend, Michael Gomez, as the W.E.B. Du Bois Lecturer. He will speak to us over the next 3 days on the topic Africa in the Age of Ascent. Today's talk is titled Ahead of His Time, Mansa Musa and the Polypoetics of Dynastic Memory. Let us welcome Michael Gomez.
I want to thank Professor Higginbotham for that wonderful introduction. I am really honored to be on your campus once again. I want to thank Professor Gates for his gracious invitation. I want to thank Amy Wolf and Matthew Weinberg for facilitating my visit. And it's good to see a number of friends, people I know, Professor Champong and others, my colleague Robin Davignon, from NYU, and others. And so I'm delighted to be here. As Matt was walking me over to this building, I remarked, or the thought came to me that this must be what it feels like to be led to the gallows. So at any rate, we'll see how this goes. And so I will use slides. I am a minimalist with respect to how that goes, and so hopefully all will go well. The general impression of the African continent, both popular and scholarly, continues to be one of essentially uninterrupted stasis over millennia, where nothing of note or interest takes place until the transatlantic slave trade and the ensuing colonial period. The actual history of West Africa, however, could not be more divergent from Occidental myth. In fact, West Africa was a region in motion politically, socially, culturally, and perpetually so during the Common Era, if not before. This was particularly true of its western savanna and Sahel from the 9th through the 16th centuries, where and when, in contrast to prevailing categories and conventions, there unfolded political innovations, as well as the evolution of such mutually constitutive categories as race, slavery, ethnicity, caste, and gendered notions of power. By the period's end, these categories would assume significations not unlike their more contemporary connotations. As indigenous responses to Islam and the trans-Saharan slave trade, these developments serve not only as a corrective to a popularized African past, but also as commentary on interpretations of modernity concerned with the transformation of global markets. Specifically, arguments that the transatlantic slave trade resulted in novel productive capacities, including industrialization and labor relations, in turn generating new hierarchies of race, class, and gender. These are all of particular relevance. Here then is an opportunity to observe the impact of parallel anterior processes. What is more, West Africa from the 13th through the 16th centuries was a region in rapid political ascent, within which the rise of Islam, the growth and influence of the domestically enslaved, and the invention and evolution of empire all proceeded at an ever-quickening pace. As such, the region would emerge as a burgeoning economic power with imperial ambitions, pursuing and enhancing commercial and diplomatic relations with North Africa and Egypt, vital to all concerned. This place and period become visible through what I am labeling polypoetics, a reference to polyvocal mechanisms by which the themes and concerns of early and medieval West Africa can be discerned. That is, polypoetics attends to the multiple ways in which technologies of memory are both created and deployed in addressing political and social developments, more or less approximating the epistemology we now call history, and in forms that constitute their own aesthetics. The West African iteration of history consists of a blend of methodologies displaying oral and written tableaux that center very different principles to tell stories for entirely different audiences and for radically different purposes. As such, polypoetics place into conversation a number of historical traditions that, beginning with the history of ancient Ghana in the 8th century, are accounts either written from outside of the region or preserved in oral traditions that, given the substantial temporal difference between events and their recollection, are often in metaphorical form. These early stories give way to subsequent generations of traditions that more concretely describe events, their transmission entrusted to professional casts of griots, oral historians, and associated praise singers who, mostly preoccupied with the 13th century founder of the Malian Empire, Sunjata, so refined the oral genre that accounts of Sunjata assume the form of a political charter within which are embedded principles and relations of governance. Griots would continue as the vehicles through whom the past was articulated with the present, variously assigned to royal families and eminent personalities, until the dawn of a new apparatus, the domestically written chronicle, entirely novel for the region, an experiment that begins in the 15th century and ends in the 17th, most famously in the form of Abdurrahman ibn Abdullah Asadi's Tariq as-Sudan, History of the Blacks, and Mahmud Khati and Ibn al-Mukhtar's Tariq al-Fatash, History of the Seeker. History is largely concerned with an imperial Songhai of the same period. This shift in the evidentiary base witnessed corresponding changes in objective, as Tariq as-Sudan was composed to protect the interest of religious and commercial elites in Timbuktu under the 17th century Moroccan occupation, while Tariq al-Fatash sought to legitimize the Askia ruling dynasty, arguing for its continuity with antecedent rulers of Imperial Ghana and Mali. Supplemented by external written sources as well as archaeological and epigraphic data, the West African corpus forms a tapestry of documentary evidence. It's a nice effect, no? I worked on that. In distillation, these sources maintain that following Sunjata's 13th century founding of the Malian Empire, a remarkable period of stability and expansion ensued under the legendary Mansa Musa, who rules from 1312 to 1337, ushering in a West Africa at its pinnacle, when Mali becomes a realm of cities, through which flowed rivers of commerce, connecting to Mediterranean and Red Sea worlds in an unprecedented continuity of cosmopolitanism. Mansa Musa would embrace Islam emphatically, breaking with predecessors in building mosques in key cities, laying the foundation for Mali's reputation as a Muslim land. Islam would soon become a principal cultural signifier, articulating a realm of growing ethnic diversity while compensating for an imperial presence guided by a minimalist theory of governance. Although tales of transoceanic misadventure remain shrouded in uncertainty, a pilgrimage just as spectacular, whose likes had never been seen, introduced to the world the aspirations of an emerging realm. This dramatic unfolding of West African possibility rested on the empire's unification of the region's three major river systems, the Niger, the Senegal, and the Gambia, heretofore unrivaled in scope, further facilitating integration into a trans-Saharan trading network of untold value. The 15th century would witness a dramatic shift in the political center of gravity from imperial Mali to Songhai, with the rise to power of the controversial leader Sunni Ali, who's in power from 1464 to 1492, who, inspired by Mali's assimilation of multiple urban centers, first established his capital at the ancient site of Gao Kukia, and I think that I can locate that if I can find the cursor. And I cannot. Sorry about that. Then rested control over the entire Middle Niger Valley, practicing a ruthlessness possibly unparalleled in the region's history. Sunni Ali, together with a son who immediately succeeds him, would be overthrown by his trusted lieutenant, Muhammad Touré, in league with Timbuktu elites. Muhammad Touré would come to be known as the Skilaj Muhammad and would reign some 36 years from 1493 to 1529. In contrast to Sunni Ali's investment in regional politics, Skilaj Muhammad ushered in a new era of international relations its dynamics characterized by intellectual vibrancy as well as social transformation. If not quite as territorially expansive or wealthy as Mali under Mansa Musa, Imperial Songhai was nonetheless twice the size of contemporary continental France. And I apologize, I cannot find the cursor. That's okay, I'm good. But we'll go, well, thank you, Professor Gates. In contrast, okay, I'll have to use this. Okay.
You want to make sure you can rework something?
It's all right. It's okay. I'll proceed. Askilaj Muhammad ushered in a new era of international relations, its dynamics characterized by intellectual vibrancy as well as social transformation. If not quite as territorially expansive or wealthy as Mali under Mansa Musa, Imperial Songhai was nonetheless twice the size of contemporary continental France. And under Askilaj Muhammad represents the height of West African cultural efflorescence and political imagination, its success characterized by novel policies of political integration. Its pursuit of erudition is unprecedented in West Africa's history, underscoring much that is distinctive about the realm. With its elites' avid embrace of Islam, Songhai became better integrated into the Muslim world, though it would not be afforded sufficient time to realize further advances. The history of early and medieval Savannah and Sahel is therefore of a piece with kings and queens and rulers of the earth consolidating lands and resources. Empires expanded and contracted in response to the vagaries of location in tandem with combinations of creed and greed. The Chinese had long been in imperial formation, transitioning from the Yuan to the Ming dynasties in the 14th century, while Europe was nearing the end of internal transformations that would have global consequences. Bridging the polarities of the so-called Old World were the Mongols of the 12th and 13th centuries, with the Golden Horde continuing to the 16th, part of whose vast expansion and fracturing included integration into states and societies all responding one way or another to the call of Islam. Ethnically, racially, and culturally myriad, a Muslim world whose political unity had long ended stretched from Iberia to China to Indonesia. Muslim innovation, largely responsible for linking European and Asian lands and all points in between, served as the conduit through which European medieval thought reconnected with that of ancient predecessors, and as the technological basis for Europe's encounter with Mesoamerican Aztecs and Andean Incas. The 14th century was therefore on the cusp of development so far-reaching that within a few hundred years, the collective human condition would be dramatically and perchance irrevocably altered. Even so, the West African Sahel was in fact a region of urban settlement long before Mansa Musa in the 14th century. The heartlands of the Malian Empire were the lower and middle Niger valleys, to the immediate north of which had preceded extensive desiccation and the creation of the Sahara, consequences of meteorological transformations from the 10th to the 8th millennia BCE. Populations responded by relocating to the Middle Niger, resulting in the gradual rise of urban culture and society. And from 800 to 400 BCE, the necessary elements of urban civilization become identifiable, followed by the emergence of the first cities from 500 BCE to 400 of the Common Era. And this is a map of the central Niger Valley. As an example of the Middle Niger's early settlement, the southwest province of Memma featured a vast number and size of urban sites during the Iron Age, which had been preceded by an equally impressive network of clustered late Stone Age hamlets and villages. Memma's occupation actually began between 3800 and 2200 BCE, its antiquity distinguishing it as paramount relative to other regions within the Middle Niger, and as a source of legitimization for a number of other subsequent polities such as Guidamaca or Gajaga, Susu, and Mali itself. Not unlike claims surrounding Memma, the oral traditions of Ja of Massina maintain that it was the first city in the Middle Niger, constituting the center of a Soninke world that would subsequently undergo a diasporic phase. Work remains to either confirm or enfeeble such claims, but it is entirely possible that Ja emerged as an urban site by 500 BCE, approximately 250 years before the famous town of Jinno. Indeed, the traditions maintain that immigrants from Ja founded Jinno, which, if true, may provide insight into Ja's diminution. Astride a commercial axis privileging East-West exchange, Ja may have suffered economically from the emergence of North-South trade between 850 CE and 950, prompting commercial families to relocate to Jinno. Jinno knew iron smelting from the beginning of its existence, and from 400 of the Common Era to 850 began complementing its iron production with that of copper, with bronze coming into use by the end of that period, and brass some 200 years later. While metallurgy was undergoing development in Jinno, the introduction of the camel into North Africa, El Maghreb, between 100 BCE and 100 CE resulted in the regularization of trade between North and West Africa. By 800 of the Common Era, therefore, Jinno was a cosmopolitan site of industry, agriculture, and commerce, surrounded by a wall 2 kilometers in circumference. Together with its nearby outposts, Jinno boasted a population of from 10,000 to 26,000 people, and when its satellite sites are taken into consideration, estimates for the entire urban cluster range in the vicinity of 50,000 people. Timbuktu was another important center in the Middle Niger, assuming urban status during the first millennium of the Common Era. While the Eastern Niger Buckle town of Gao, site of secondary copper processing, had been occupied some 1,500 years before either Jinno or Ja. By 800 of the Common Era, then, there were a number of urban centers in the Middle Niger engaged in commercial and manufacturing and agricultural activity, sufficient to support numerically significant populations. Urban life is rarely associated with early West Africa, as we have been socialized to think of the region very differently. The weaponization of the colonial imagination and its attendant discourses on civilization and racialized hierarchies have been effective, but largely through the archaeological and, to a lesser extent, linguistic record. The unveiling of early West Africa continues, supplementing, if not surpassing, oral accounts in detail and reliability. To continue our journey into such a storied and multifaceted past is to therefore necessarily progress through thoroughfares of human memory, now orally stylized, then recorded on parchment. Rather than their consideration in discrete and disaggregated form, my own position is that such sources are best understood when placed into mutual conversation, together with archaeological and epigraphic evidence where possible, in effect achieving a new archive. Such an approach best yields results when immersed in dynamics of context that attend to personal, familial, cultural, and political dimensions, and in which circumstances of production are extensively engaged. As critical components of collective testimony, the written and oral documentation were conceptually innovative and wholly unprecedented for place and period, representing either the creation or adoption of memorative technologies in response to novel developments. Their conjunctive examination reveals a process as integral to the accounts as the characters and plots they feature. The result is a new interpretation of West Africa's early and medieval history, facilitating its relocation from the periphery to the center of world history. And the dominant figure in West African medieval history within the larger framing of global history is Mansa Musa. At the head of Mali's sprawling empire, he was aware of developments elsewhere. He probably knew of Berber success in engineering a kingdom that, beginning with the 11th century, the late 11th century's religious militancy of the Almoravids stretched from the fringes of West Africa through North Africa and into southern Europe. He most likely understood that Sunjata's 13th century feats were partially informed by political upheaval to the northwest in North Africa or El Maghreb, reconfiguring commerce and travel through the Sahara. As trade with the northeast was also of considerable vintage, Mali would have also been keenly aware of Egypt. Whether in response to these developments or as an expansion of aspirations largely internal, Mali attempted to connect with the outside world, to touch that world directly, absent the mediation of Saharan middlemen. Mali was itself in an expansive transcontinental frame of mind. The very claim that toward the beginning of the 14th century, Mansa Muhammad ibn Ku, grandson or great-grandson of Sunjata, prepared the launch of hundreds of vessels into the Atlantic Ocean, inaugurating West Africa's own large-scale seafaring venture into the deep, is indicative of the prevailing mood. The labor, material, and organization for the expedition, if indeed it took place, would have been extraordinary, suggesting a level of ambition on a breathtaking scale, an attempt to reverse patterns of trans-regional engagement prevailing since the Garamantes of Greco-Roman antiquity, reinforced and intensified by their descendants, the Berber and Tuareg. Organized and financed in North Africa for the most part, such trans-Saharan commerce resulted in accruing trans-regional expertise and advantage. Even if entirely mythical, the account of Muhammad ibn Ku's gambit reflects recognition of Mali's landlocked status, the unknown Western Sea beckoning resolution. But rather than accounts of new treasure and trading prospects, their return reports of failure at sea and massive loss of life, followed by the disappearance of Muhammad ibn Ku himself, who, commanding a second fleet, is never heard from again. The source attesting to Muhammad ibn Ku's Atlantic project was Mansa Musa himself, underscoring that its very imagining is far more critical to the question of the Mansa's agenda than its verifiability. That he would tell such a story while in Cairo more than suggests a desire to transfigure his relationship to the wider world. Whatever his actual ambition, he would settle upon a course that had no parallel, though in scope and scale hardly less ambitious than his predecessor's purported Western watery trajectory, and indeed quite consistent with it. For within 12 years of his coming to power, Mansa Musa would bring together the considerable resources of the realm to make an unprecedented pilgrimage to Egypt and Arabia, the known founts of political and spiritual power, where he would make his case for the recognition of Mali as a peer. Traveling with a retinue of thousands across some 2,700 miles, the effect was nothing less than scintillating, leaving an impression in Europe as well as Egypt. If only brilliant theater, the voyage nonetheless became iconic, emblematic of West Africa's wealth and potential. In bringing Mali to the world, the Mansa succeeded in elevating its global stature while attracting both greater commercial attention and cultural investment. It is Mali's, and by extension West Africa's, most illustrious moment. In undertaking such an extraordinary venture, Neither Mansa Musa's precise objectives nor his plans to achieve them are transparent. Perhaps he simply wanted to elevate Mali's profile on the world stage, leveraging influence relative to North Africa by affecting closer relations with the Central Islamic lands. Or he may have been in search of foreign assistance to maximize Mali's potential, his over-the-top display of wealth designed to persuade needed expertise to relocate to West Africa. It is even conceivable that, reaching the limits of the desert to the north and the forest to the south, he envisioned a trans-regional empire by which he could project power into North Africa. For all of the splendor and sizzle of one of the world's most famous pilgrimages, the fundamental dynamics of trans-regional commercial relations would remain unchanged. Financing and routes outside of West Africa remained under the control of trading partners, an arrangement that would only intensify over the next several centuries, at the end of which West Africa, along with the rest of the continent, would find themselves subject to nations swiftly advancing in the knowledge of seafaring. Furthermore, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage in relation to subsequent events took place from 25 to 125 years too soon. He would selectively borrow what he observed, initiating a series of cultural projects in Mali modeled after Central Islamic features. However, as weaponry would prove rather decisive in West Africa's ensuing history, in that moment, there were no appreciable differences between the Mamluks and the Malians, as both relied on archery, cavalry, and lances, although some tactics differed. Gunpowder weapons, a technological revolution, had yet to fully develop. As Mansa Musa possessed the resources to pay for such technology, their adoption might have better prepared the region for the challenges to come. His rise to power and command of untold wealth were therefore arguably too soon, whereas by the time Songhai reached its height 200 years later, it was already too late, as the empire was apparently completely unaware of gunpowder weapons, the key to Morocco's defeat of Songhai in 1591. Mansa Musa is therefore the embodiment of Mali as a trans-regional cosmopolitan state, with its vast commercial ventures and rapidly rising centers of learning at Timbuktu and Guinea, attracting scholars and students from not only West Africa, but from the larger Islamic world. What is known about him benefits from a dramatic shift in the sources, from the orature of Sunjata's era to external records and eyewitness accounts written in Arabic, this time more fully incorporating information from the 17th century chronicles. This is the period of Mali's maturity and greatest territorial expansion, the moment in which it emerges as a trans-regional power, and when West Africa as a region, literally and figuratively, enters the spatial and imaginary dimensions of Europe and the Central Islamic lands. There are 5 major sources for Imperial Mali: Ibn Battuta, al-Umari, Ibn Khaldun, and the aforementioned Tariq as-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash. The first, Ibn Battuta, is an eyewitness account, whereas the Tariqs or the Tuareg are internal chronicles at some 300 years removed from Mali's apex. This is because with Mali's emergence, the internal record falls silent. As the oralists of the region, the Jeliu, have little to say about either medieval Mali or Mansa Musa, focused as they are on Sunjata. That the Jeliu are mute is more than quizzical, since Musa is arguably Mali's most legendary figure. His absence from the orature may be explained by Islam's growing influence and preference for him, together with matters of succession and legitimacy. More sobering, if not stunning, is the realization that absent the fascination of external sources emanating from far beyond its borders, what is known about Mali at its zenith would be very little indeed and would give rise to significant interpretive distortion. In fact, it is stunning that little of the conventional time-honored practices of memorative technology were expended in efforts to remember someone so pivotal, even transformational, as Mansa Musa. The reasons for this are far from evident, but there are a few possibilities. The first has to do with the Malian and by extension West African view of history. Given the highly performative dimension of the Jeliu, it could be argued that the objective is not so much the preservation of the past for future generations as it is the recreation of the past in the present, in the hearing and experience of the living, such that the imperative is an engagement with the moment, not necessarily the future. In this way, Mansa Musa's story may have become less and less relevant in facing the challenges of subsequent centuries, whereas the chartering dimension of Sunjata's story became even more important. A second consideration is therefore not unrelated to the first, and arguably more compelling, that despite his international stature, within Mali, Mansa Musa was far less popular, and that his legitimacy, not the first time that would happen, and that his legitimacy was questioned by oral historians in the service of a rival royal branch, explaining his diminution in their collective recollection. Now, this is all speculative, but whatever the reasons, it is the case that much of what we know about Mansa Musa comes from the written account of outsiders. That someone so illustrious was but a voyage away from near anonymity, like some political quasar, is truly astounding. Mansa Musa would rule for 25 years, 1312 to 1337, initiating changes that created a critical platform for Islam's emergence in West Africa. At their origin lay what is incontrovertibly one of the most important, if not signal events in West African history, his 1324 pilgrimage or Hajj, an enormous undertaking unprecedented in scope. It was through the Hajj of Mansa Musa that the Central Islamic lands, for centuries cognizant of Bilad as-Sudan, something that I'll talk about tomorrow, that is the land of the blacks, at least as a concept, became much more aware of its wealth and potential. Europe, its ideas about Africa rather inchoate, was put on notice that a powerful and rich kingdom lay south of the Sahara. As a result of his feat, Mansa Musa acquired iconic status the world over, with Musa, not Sunjata, dominating the visual field of Imperial Mali's representation. Due to the number of people and quantity of goods involved in the journey, much of the 12-year span between Musa's intronization and his arrival in Cairo, where he remained for 3 months before continuing on to Mecca, would have been spent in preparation. This is a photograph of the citadel in Cairo, and Mansa Musa was there. Had a very, very memorable encounter with the Mamluk ruler, about which I write in African Dominion. According to Ibn Kathir, when he arrived in Cairo in June of 1324, Mansa Musa was a handsome young man. El-Halabi confirms that he was, quote, a young man, brown-skinned with a pleasant face and handsome appearance. According to El-Halabi, he traveled with a retinue of more than 10,000, appearing on horseback, magnificently dressed in the midst of his soldiers, while Ibn Kathir reports Musa was accompanied by 20,000 Maghrebis, or presumably West Africans, and slaves upon arrival in Cairo. West Africa's internal documents also score the numbers, with Tariq as-Sudan generously allowing that Musa made the pilgrimage, quote, with great pomp and a large group with an army of 60,000 men who walked before him as he rode. There were also 500 slaves, and in the hand of each was a golden staff, each made from 500 mithqals of gold," unquote. Expressions of hyperbole notwithstanding, the numbers of the enslaved arriving in Cairo were clearly impressive, but even more astonishing was the amount of gold they carried. Ibn Khaldun estimates the Malians imported 80 loads of gold dust. That is nearly 27,000 pounds or 13 tons of gold, while El-Umari states that Musa left his country with 100 loads of gold, about 33,600 pounds, equaling 17 tons. This is raw, unworked specie or tibr. And when the golden staffs of the 500 slaves are included, the total rises to just over, to about 35,600 pounds, about 18 tons. Well within the conjecture that the auriferous fields of Bouré and Bambouk produce 4 tons and 0.5 tons of gold per annum, respectively, totaling 45 tons in 10 years. Though approximations, these estimates make the point that an enormous amount of gold was in transit, enough to depress its value in Cairo for some time. Discussion of the Mansaz undertaking the pilgrimage does not address why he went in the first place, or why he proceeded in such an extravagant fashion. Attempts to answer this question return to the thorny matter of sources and to one of the more controversial aspects of Musa's reign. You have to hang in there with me now. From the evidence, there are at least 3 immediate considerations with a 4th to come. The first concerns shoring up his claims to power, driven by a need to quell questions surrounding the succession. A second consideration was interest in expanding the spatial parameters of Mali's territorial claims in order to access and control a larger share of commercial markets, and in a manner that allowed Mali to maintain imperium through means other than military force. The third objective was the elevation and recognition of Mali as a transregional, if not global power, evincing a quest to escape regional circumscription. Musa would clearly achieve the first 2 goals, but only partially reach the third, as Mali would certainly emerge as a trans-regional force, but experience resistance to its more global aspirations. As to the initial matter, Tariq el-Fatash provides a fascinating explanation. Quote, "As for his pilgrimage, the reason for it was told to me by the student and keeper of the traditions of the ancestors, Muhammad Kuma, who mentioned that the Malikoi, that is the king of Mali, Kankan Musa, is the one who accidentally killed his mother, Nana Kankan. And he was sorrowful about this and regretted it and feared retribution for it. So he gave large amounts of wealth as alms and resolved to fast for the rest of his life. He asked some of the ulama, the learned ones, scholars of his time, what he should do to be forgiven for this great offense. One of them said to him, 'It is my opinion that you should seek asylum with the messenger of God. May God bless him and grant him peace.' That very day he resolutely made up his mind, and he began to gather wealth and provisions for the journey, calling upon his kingdom on every side and demanding supplies and assistance." The passage contains a number of suspenseful elements, beginning with the accidental killing of Musa's mother, Nana Kankan, or Mother Kankan, or Grandmother Kankan. Kankan is more likely Kanku, a female Mandi name, so that Kankan Musa would literally mean Musa, the son of Kanku. Whether she was his mother, grandmother, or the mother of a sibling by a common father, there are weighty implications here, as matricide is a serious affair, especially the royal variety. If it occurred before or soon after Musa took power, the probability of intrigue is high. His efforts at appeasement, giving alms, fasting, may therefore have represented attempts to assuage aggrieved royal family members, with the name Kankan Musa evidence of the strategy's failure and the aggrieved's determination to never let him forget. Written sources closely affiliated with Muslim interests consistently portray Musa as a model of piety and are pressed to explain his inconsistencies. Tariq el-Fatash introduces him as virtuous, God-fearing, a worshiper of God, providing examples of his virtue, building mosques, liberating slaves, before addressing the issue of matricide, thereby mitigating its appalling nature. The advice to seek asylum and forgiveness in Mecca ostensibly responds to an apprehension of divine punishment, but Musa may have been just as preoccupied with human reprisal. The barakah, or communicable blessing of the pilgrimage, would therefore strengthen his hand against offended factions, while solidifying his alliance with Muslim clerics and merchants. It is noteworthy that the story of Musa accidentally killing a maternal royal figure was never told in Cairo during his pilgrimage, where and when so many other stories about him were generated. It would have been difficult for him to explain it there, but its surfacing several centuries later in Tariq el-Fatash demonstrates it was well remembered within West Africa. In fact, that the story continued in West Africa through the period of Imperial Songhai, as conveyed by its chroniclers, indicates it retained significant resonance for at least 300 years, so that the circumstances of Mansa Musa's rise to power must have been rather controversial at the time. But there is a fourth, even more speculative, but arguably more intriguing explanation as to why the Mansa made pilgrimage, and it returns to the aforementioned account that has long captured the imagination of many. This is the report of West African voyages that, setting sail for the West, forms one basis for scholarly claims that Africans disembarked in pre-colonial America. It was Musa who, while in Cairo, told this story. When asked how he had come to power, he replied, "The king who was my predecessor did not believe it was impossible to discover the furthest limit of the Atlantic Ocean and wished vehemently to do so. So he equipped 300 ships filled with men and the same number equipped with gold, water, and provisions enough to last them for years. They departed, and a long time passed before anyone came back. Then one ship returned, and we asked the captain what news they brought. He said, 'Yes, O Sultan, we traveled for a long time until there appeared in the open sea, as it were, a river with a powerful current. The other ships went on ahead, but when they reached that place, they did not return. As for me, I went about, that is, I turned around at once and did not enter that river. But the Sultan disbelieved him. Then that Sultan got ready 2,000 ships, 1,000 for himself and the men whom he took with him, and 1,000 more for water and provisions. He left me," Musa is saying, "to deputize for him, and embarked on the Atlantic Ocean with his men. That was the last we saw of him and all those who were with him, and so I became king in my own right." Silent on the matter of matricide, Musa instead offers an account of oceanic voyages, intimating his own skepticism that the ruler in question, Muhammad ibn Ku, or his father, was unrealistic if not irrational, as he dismissed the report of the initial expedition's lone survivor. Taking a foolhardy gamble, he suffered the consequences, with Musa's ascension the result. Now, beyond the substance of what Musa says is its import, as it conveys an atmosphere of crisis, of matters unfolding unexpectedly, out of anticipated sequence, that intrigue and internecine conflict inform the succession, shifting power from one royal branch to another, and in such a fashion that Musa's predecessor is never again heard from, is certainly plausible, heightened not only by preceding succession turbulence, but also by Musa's very undertaking of the pilgrimage. The possible mythical quality of imperial naval expeditions from Mali through the Atlantic is strengthened by the account's absence elsewhere in the sources, as such a major undertaking would have left an indelible imprint upon the collective imagination, and presumably would have registered elsewhere. That neither Ibn Khaldun nor the oral corpus mention it is most curious. The absence of supporting evidence certainly gives pause, but on its own fails to generate skepticism sufficient to completely dismiss these voyages, as corroboration for one element of the story derives from oceanographic studies. In blaming the first voyage's failure on, quote, a river with a powerful current, unquote, the survivor seems to refer to the Canary Current, a year-round movement of water flowing south along the West African coast from what is now southern Morocco to Guinea, then westward in the form of the equatorial currents to the Gulf of Mexico, where they become the Gulf Stream, then back across the Atlantic toward Europe and North and West Africa, its southern branch once more forming the Canary Current, renewing the cycle. Some 1,000 kilometers in width, it would have been difficult to miss. Why or how such an experience, with its basis in observable verity, would be included in an otherwise wholly fabricated story remains an open question. That the Canary Current is referenced indicates it was surely encountered. In addition to the Canary Current, a second obstacle to the return of the fleet, but not necessarily its launch, would have been the available technology, as West Africans, or at least Senegambians, possessed naval capacities ill-suited for a voyage of some 1,600 miles or 2,500 kilometers, the distance between Senegal and Brazil. Senegambian pirogues, boats made of hollowed-out trees, may have been similar to the canoes of the indigenous Caribs of the Lesser Antilles, but the latter's navigations were largely confined to inter-island circumlocution. Perhaps a more useful comparison is with the Polynesians, whose double-hulled vessels covered inter-island travel as well as vast distances across the Pacific Ocean, leading to speculation that they also reached the Americas. Like the Polynesians, West Africans may have initiated a transatlantic journey, but there is no evidence of a successful return. The challenge of effecting the return, such that long-distance sailing could become regularized, was gradually solved in Europe through combining different types of vessels, as well as appropriating tacking and the lateen sail, technology and procedures known to East Africans and others plying the East Indian Ocean, but apparently unknown to Africans in the West. But even if entirely mythical, the mere rendition of such voyages nonetheless reflects a certain aggressiveness, a kind of restlessness on the part of a growing central authority fueled by unchecked territorial expansion. Mali was in a moment of dramatic rise. The evidence neither proves nor disproves the historicity of these voyages, but resolution of this particular mystery is not the primary concern here. Rather, the related riddle of Musa's succession is what is at stake, with the story of oceanic travel inadvertently opening an important vista into that probe. If untrue, if the account of Atlantic voyages was an artifice, with Musa inventing the story to impress his host while concealing the contested nature of his succession, it would further suggest that he may have been a usurper. And if a usurper, the parallel internal account of matricide would have been a coded reference to his arrogation, whether or not the oceanic ventures were fact or fable. Adding to the puzzle of Musa becoming Mansa of Mali is the account of one Sakura. If an actual Malian ruler, Sakura would have preceded Musa by as many as 18 years or as few as 3. Whether Sakura was an actual person is complicated by Ibn Khaldun's report that not only did he make pilgrimage, but he also greatly expanded Malians' territorial claims, reaching the Atlantic Ocean in the west while defeating and incorporating Gao in the east. That is, he accomplished precisely what Mansa Musa is credited with accomplishing. A coincidence so suspect that Ibn Khaldun further investigated the matter, subsequently including the account of one El-Hajj Yunus, the Takruri interpreter, who insisted that it was Mansa Musa who conquered Gao and not Sakura. In introducing Sakura, Ibn Khaldun says that he was actually a Maula or client of the royals who, quote, usurped their kingship, unquote, after assassinating his predecessor. Complimenting Ibn Khaldun, oral sources refer to Sakura as the usurper and a royal slave, while also naming him Jonin Sakure, or the little slave. The resonance between Sakura and Mansa Musa invites the hypothesis that the former prefigures the latter, not only in his accomplishments, but in his dubious claims to power. As such, traditionists may have invented the foil of Sakura to critique Mansa Musa from the safety of temporal distance. On the other hand, if in fact undertaken, the Atlantic voyages would have persuaded Musa of the unviability of oceanic endeavor, that the Sahara was the only sea through which contacts might be expanded. Strengthening commercial ties with Cairo, as opposed to North Africa, may have been part of the calculus, but geopolitical considerations could also have been uppermost in Musa's mind, leading to the determination that an alliance with the Mamluks in Egypt would strengthen Mali's position within a rapidly changing Islamic landscape. Developments beyond the region could therefore have played an important role in shaping the timing and substance of Musa's pilgrimage. North Africa was in constant political upheaval, as the Maronids were preoccupied with managing a complex series of relations with the Nasrid Muslim dynasty of Granada and the Christian state of Castile. In contrast, the Ayyubids, ascending the power under Saladin in 1174, had established control over Egypt and Syria in 1250, only to be overthrown in Egypt by the formerly servile Mamluks, who, in turn, stemmed the Mongol juggernaut after the latter's capture of Baghdad in 1258, defeating the Mongols in 1260. As the only power to withstand the Mongols, the accomplishment of the Mamluks was all the more impressive, with Egypt emerging as the center of Sunni Islamic culture and the Muslim world, until their defeat at the hands of the Ottomans in 1517. In addition to its proximity to the Hijaz, therefore, Egypt would have been highly attractive to Mali as a stable diplomatic as well as commercial partner, and though Mali would continue its correspondence with Maghrebian states, it made sense to invest more substantially in a polity in like Ascent. Mansa Musa would return to West Africa around 1326, expanding Mali's imperium along the way. Mali's territorial claims now extended from the Niger Buckle in the east to Senegambia and the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and from the Sahara in the north to the edge of the forest in the south, Mali and arguably the whole of West Africa was at its apex. I conclude. Faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges in navigating waters off of the West African coast, Malians instead focused on expansion through the Sahara. But had they known the world was in a truly transformative period, they may have reconsidered investing in maritime endeavor, as this was precisely the moment when Asia and Europe were beginning their own transoceanic voyages, ventures that would establish their domination over commercial and political developments elsewhere in the world. Arabs, Indians, and East Africans had long plied the waters of the Indian Ocean, while Zheng He, under China's Ming Dynasty in the early 15th century, undertook 7 such voyages, eventually reaching East Africa itself. Developments in Europe, however, were at a scale and scope altogether very different, such that all of the aforementioned societies would eventually be affected by those developments. So would West Africa, and it would never be the same. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Okay.
Questions? Comments?
Yes.
Thank you. That was wonderful. That was really wonderful. And I have read African Dominion, which is amazing. It says it's on.
Try it like that.
Hello? Okay. Well, I was saying that was truly wonderful. And I have read African Dominion, which is amazing. Everybody should read it. But so here was my question. Who is the one who becomes the caliphate?
The caliphate.
Caliphate. Whatever, Caliphate.
Well, there are a number of different caliphates.
But wasn't Mansa Musa one of them? Did he get that title?
No.
Oh, he didn't
no,
get
you
that
mean
title.
within West Africa?
Yes.
Well, it's much later you have the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate in what is now northern Nigeria. That's a 19th century development. This is a very interesting question because it's with Skilaj Muhammad in the 15th century.
Okay.
Yes,
He's the
that
one.
we have this definitive kind of Islamization of a West African polity, and so in the literature, from time to time you'll have references to the ruler as a sultan and so forth, but the caliphate as such, and I'm not sure but the caliphate as such comes into existence when you have beginning in the late 17th century through the 18th century and 19th centuries, the determination on the part of clerices to establish theocracies in West Africa. And so you go through a number of these in Bundu, and Futajalon, and Futatoro, but it's in Sokoto in northern Nigeria that the term caliphate is.
What's behind your question?
No, because I have this noted, and I forget which one of these leaders, but one of them, I had the word caliphate to him, and I forget which one of the leaders of the empires. And so I don't know if that's an era, so I want to make sure that...
Well, there is a... in some of the... In one of the succession processes, there is an individual who is called Khalifa. I don't know if you're referring to him.
I don't know. I don't remember now. So,
all right. But that's but the term
no,
caliphate
but this
is
has helped me.
Anglicizing of Khalifa.
This has helped me. Okay.
Which means successor.
Okay. And the other question that I have, because what surprised me reading your book is Sundiata. So we've always been called him Sundiata, and now I've got to tell all these people with that name that it's spelled wrong. What is the? How does that
Well,
go?
it's just the French DI.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's with Sunjata.
Yeah,
So-
it's not that it's spelled wrong. It's just
Yes,
a
it's
different way
fine.
of translating it.
Okay. It's just that when he writes it,
I just use the J.
he
I just-
uses the
I just-
J and not the
you know,
DI.
I'm writing
Okay.
in English, so I use the DI.
Yeah, but that's like Linda Haywood with
A
Zynga.
instead of E. Oh,
Yeah, I mean,
okay, and-
it's the same person.
Okay.
It's just
no, I
another
know,
way of
but
saying
I'm
it.
trying to figure out in writing about him now, should I be using the J or the DI?
It's up to. It doesn't matter. I mean,
Okay.
you can use the DI or the J.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's pronounced J. Yeah, J. It's pronounced as a J.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I've long been fascinated, as you know. I made 2 series about ancient Africa, and
Yes.
in both of them I talk about Mansa Musa, and I talk about, this was in the references to an encyclopedist who was in Cairo, right? And he's interviewing him, like, who are you? You know where you're from. And then there's this crazy story, and except I never thought it was crazy, because the elements are so wild. I mean, you can't make it up. He says, I'm not the legitimate ruler. I'm just occupying the throne temporarily. The real guy is sailing and discovering he's going to find New York and Rio de Janeiro and, Mexico City. And, where would you even get the idea that you could sail to the West? The thing is, it's just, the historians, of course, in Europe would just say, this is ridiculous. It couldn't have happened. But I've always presumed that it did happen, but that they didn't get there. Now, if Ivan Van Sertima was here, he would say, yes, this is the smoking pistol. This is how these black people got to, Mexico and South Africa,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. But it's just as wild that he made the pilgrimage to Mecca in the first place.
Yes.
To me, both stories are equally outrageous.
Yes.
And we know the one to be true because he actually did it.
He was there.
He was there.
He made it.
He also was the richest man in the history of the world. If you Google, what's the website? There's a website.
Yes.
You Google right here. It's just Google richest man in the world, and you get Mansa Musa.
Yes.
Who was, according to today's wealth, the estimate's worth $400 billion. Bill Gates is like on welfare next to Mansa Musa. And no, that's the truth. There's the website, you'll see him at the top. And we tend to forget that for thousands of years, Northerners, whether you could put Egypt in that, if you want to go back that far, and then plus medieval Europe, got all their gold from some part of Africa. The reason Nubia and Egypt hated each other is that the resources, the gold for Egypt came from Nubia. The gold of medieval Europe came from different sites in Africa. This guy was tremendously smart, tremendously powerful, understood the value of books, knew the value of gold, and when the Catalan Atlas,
Which I'll talk about tomorrow.
Huh?
I'll talk about the Catalan Atlas
Tomorrow,
tomorrow.
he's the most famous African in the history of Europe because he's there with a nugget of gold and a gold crown and a scepter.
Yes.
Representing black people in Africa. I mean, he was a real dude. The guy was a genius.
Yeah.
But I hadn't heard. So I happened without any proof. I want the story of the 2000
Yes.
boats. But I want it to be true.
Yes.
And until somebody proves that it's not true,
Yes.
it's true as far as I'm,
Yes.
I'm concerned.
Yes.
But I didn't know anything about the matricide.
Yes.
And then you get into, you can almost do Freudian analysis of that, because then you're talking about, allegories of power and success, just in the way that you did. I don't care what kind of interpretation, but it sounds allegorical.
Yes.
And what's really being preserved about orders of succession and.
This is an interesting question because within the context of mandate society, it's very, very serious. Given the place of, the focus will be on women and gender in the third discussion, the third day. So I'll talk about that more specifically there. But within mandate culture, the place not only of women, but the place of the mother is so revered that for this to And you see this in the Sunjata epic. You see this in the, well, I call it the Sunjata epic, but you see this in the orature concerning Sunjata, and there's a huge corpus of literature on Sunjata. But they are very much aligned around the question of Sunjata's relationship with his mother, which is sacrosanct. It's a very tight relationship. So, and that, whether that actually represents, Sunjata's actual relationship to his mother, it certainly represents a sensibility of value in Mande society. So for Musa to have, quote unquote, accidentally engaged in matricide is a very serious matter. And so, and I think that helps to explain why it doesn't go away. Right. And, but with respect to the matter of Africans arriving in the Americas, so my own position is I haven't really looked at that. I do know that there is debate among Latin Americanists who have looked at that, and what I would say is that needs to be placed in the conversation with the literature on the Polynesians, who are basically engaged with the same kind of technology.
Yes, and until that recent archaeological work, nobody thought it would be. So you take this story and think, all they have is a bunch of canoes, right? How are they going to go all the way across the ocean? Except when you learn from DNA evidence now about how the Hawaii was populated, Polynesia, et cetera, you realize, wow, people actually did this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's very complicated. I'm not making that argument.
No.
But what I like about your work and the work of a lot of other scholars, of course, is that it shows, and it's a very simple thing to remember, but it's so counter what we were told when we were growing up, that the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean were highways. Mm. They were highways, and that people were communicating. People were trading. Civilizations were exchanging ideas for time immemorial. And you talked about the crucial element, which is the technological innovation that enhanced this, of course, was the domestication of the camel, which you dated between 100 BC and 100 AD, about that time.
Yes.
But even before that, people were still
moving, yes.
as incredible as it seems, still,
yes,
talking to each other. But I think one of the most pernicious aspects of the colonization of African history and the colonization of the African experience, because of the slave trade, was reversing that narrative, so saying that our common African ancestors were all isolated, static, never moved around, never talked to each other, just lived in huts and, did whatever they did for 10,000 years, and it was, it's a pernicious lie.
Yeah, and I think too that and this is why the anthropological record is becoming so very important. And as that progresses, we're learning much more about, what's happening in various parts of Africa. It's just a whole world is unveiling.
I would add anthropological and DNA, the DNA evidence too. That's where I live,
Okay.
Okay. Questions, comments, Jacob. Do you have the microphone there? And then Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Master Kanka Musa, it's obviously a very complex character. My high school teacher described him as follows. Master Musa was the first to create for all Negroes a prestige which even today is grudgingly granted her, in reference to Africa. Mm-hmm. I think this was 1967 or 8. There's always the question of the political versus the religious. So my question for you is, this. Why has it been difficult for maybe scholars to suggest a purely religious explanation for the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, given the fact that it is obligatory for Muslims to do the Hajj? And that from this period to the present period, the head of the kingdom, say Nigeria, the Sultan, will probably be asked to lead the pilgrims to Mecca. They are appointed by the state to do that. So the religious obligation is primary. And that is very important to even a historian of religion. Religion qua religion as the major motive for performing the pilgrimage. The second question relates to how Mansa Musa is seen today in the context of the contemporary African crisis. When you find a leader stealing our money and spending it anyhow, they will say he's behaving like Kanka Musa as a way of explaining that. So in other words, they are invoking that history to explain the past, to explain the present. It doesn't take away from all his achievements. And that's why I started with that quotation that I earlier gave, which was a high school, I'm talking of a high school lesson, a lecture in the 60s. So how do we deal with this, this very complex character? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, those are very good questions. I don't know that I will be able to answer them well. I'll do the best I can. With respect to the expectation obligation, one of the pillars of Islam, of course, is to perform Hajj. And so you're absolutely right. There's nothing necessarily remarkable about the fact that Mansa Musa performs Hajj because it's part of the, one of the 5 pillars of the faith. I would agree with that, except that as a political ruler, it would be very difficult to not take into consideration political considerations that surround not only making the Hajj, but the way in which he makes it. And just looking at the record and the evidence for there being some trouble, there was some trouble there. One of the things about the succession, both in Imperial Mali and Songhai, is that there's a general sense of who becomes Mansa or Sunni or Shia. There's a general sense of who makes it, who succeeds, but the rules of succession are not airtight and they're not so specific. And for the reason for that is so that in the event that someone is actually more qualified to become the ruler, you need to have that wiggle room so that person can amass the support to do what he needs to do, and to become the ruler. So the succession, both Mali and Songhai there's just especially when we get to Songhai, there's just a history of contested succession. So the question of legitimization becomes really, really important. And the Hajj, in addition to being something that is just consistent with the religion, is also a mechanism by which legitimization can be reached. And the way in which Musa goes about this, I think, is very, very instructive. That is the way he makes pilgrimage. He didn't have to bring all this gold with him. There were political dimensions to this trip. Another way to think about this is subsequently in the Askia dynasty in Imperial Songhai. When Eskil Muhammad takes power, this is interesting. Muhammad Touré is Sunni Ali's lieutenant. He's a hand-picked lieutenant. He's very close to Sunni Ali. Yet he turns on Sunni Ali. He has no right to rule Imperial Songhai. He is an illegitimate ruler insofar as that's concerned. He has no right to the throne. What does Eskil Muhammad do? The first thing he does is he makes Hajj. So the Hajj then not only is a religious thing, but it also it creates the necessary kind of mechanism by which a person can legitimize his rule. And so that's very important.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on your sort of reflections on polypoetics.
Yes.
And you kind of charted three genres, going from oral storytelling to more professional griots emerging from like the 13th century, to a more written text or form from the 15th century. As we talk about, I mean, you just referenced Muhammad Touré or Askia Muhammad. We've talked about Mansa Musa as possibly a usurper. And I'm looking at this tension between oral sources and written sources, and the dominance of oral sources in traditional capitals, and how both Mansa Musa and Touré will kind of pivot towards Timbuktu, and a different kind of genre of chroniclers as they seek to perhaps create a different tradition in competition to the oral tradition. And whether you can speak to this tension and the place of Timbuktu in this kind of turning away from oral traditions, which perhaps included very subtle or not so subtle critiques of these usurpers.
So, Professor Champa, that's a very, very astute question. You always ask such questions. And that's very, very important because, you know, as the epochs unfold, you will have, arguably from the 17th century on, a kind of engagement, if you will, between oralists and the use of writing to augment their practice. And so that doesn't make them chroniclers per se, but it does represent a kind of incorporation of that particular kind of technology. But what you've picked up on is very important. The oral traditions of Mali and even Songhai allude to Islam. They make some space for Islam, but they are not written from that perspective. And they're very much invested in the indigenous, autochthonous concept of power. And so they're not necessarily anti-Islam, but they're certainly not, you know, written by, at least in the earlier periods. Now, once again, as we move forward, the 17th century forward, you see more of an amalgamation, but in this earlier period, the oralists are not necessarily those to whom we can turn to get a real sense of the growth of the religion. And there does seem to be some tension. Now, that may have to do with the fact that they tend to be affiliated with, associated with, you know, various royal families and branches and so forth and so on. many of which, if not most of whom, were not Muslim. Now, with respect to the oral traditions insofar as Imperial Songhai is concerned, we have Tariq al-Fatah, Tariq al-Sudan, which are these written chronicles which tend to support Eskil Muhammad. They're going to support Eskil Muhammad because Eskil Muhammad deposed Sunni Ali. But when you look at the oral traditions which circulate around Sunni Ali, they are very anti-Eskil Muhammad and are very anti-Islamic. So there is this tension between, kind of oralists in these traditions and those who come along later who write these chronicles, and they're writing from a particular kind of perspective that tends to be pro-Islam and so forth. So these tensions are, you're absolutely right, the tensions are there in the shifting in the evidentiary base. And we're getting these different perspectives on what's going on in the society. And it's really fascinating. It's just really, very fascinating.
I have a question. So I've read a book.
Yes.
Read the book African Dominion, and I appreciated sort of what you elaborated on in the presentation. I guess my question is, I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit more on the idea of African Dominion as it relates to the project. I was struck by the way you opened the talk when you talked about how people think of the African continent as stagnant for much of its history before colonialism, and then you talked about how these events set in motion developments to come. And I'm wondering if, implicit in your argument is the idea that what happened in medieval Africa is more useful as a template for thinking about African sovereignty than, say, like what happens in the colonial era. Would you take the argument that far? Would you say that sort of the forms of trade and diplomacy you're sketching out sort of put things in place that we ought to contend with? Are you sort of encouraging people to shift their periodization? I'd just love to hear you reflect more on what's at stake for you in the project.
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I think that, I want to be careful how I answer this question, especially since you're taping. Studying African history in graduate school, I was always interested in the fact, and I believe it is a fact, that Africanists who were teaching African history were much more comfortable with that history once they got to the colonial period, and would even say so. And that prior to this time, prior to the colonial period, there just simply was there was an absence of investment in that period, and I've always wondered about that. I don't know if the issue is languages. I'm not convinced that that's the case. You could easily, not necessarily easily, but you can prepare, right, to engage with that kind of earlier history. And so something that was always very curious to me. And so this project, African Dominion, has taken a long time. And I've been, doing different things. But I became interested in this project as a graduate student. And I was discouraged from pursuing it as a dissertation. And in retrospect, that was a good thing. Because one of the things about history, I don't know if everyone would agree with me, but there's a perspective that you gain with seasoning that you just don't have as a younger scholar. And so... Why were you discouraged from doing it? Yeah. It wasn't because they said your perspective will be better. Well, yeah. Yes, please.
But one thing, archaeological evidence is relatively recent. So, we do have now archaeological evidence from people who've worked in Gao, for example, and there's just, I mean, it's like a gold mine
Yes.
of information. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think that certainly, so certainly subsequent discoveries have facilitated this conversation and have definitely added a great deal to what we know. With respect to why I was discouraged, it probably had to do with maybe a sense on the part of my advisors that, I needed more grounding, or I needed more time with the material, and so that's fine. That's fine. I don't, the reasons may not necessarily be invidious. I don't know, but to go back to the question about African dominion, this was a time in which we can assess, at least in West Africa, the ways in which Africans engage with notions of polity, engage with notions of ethnicity, race, gender. It's all there, okay? And on their own terms, and try to negotiate through these different terrains. And it represents a point in time when Africans were clearly in control of their destinies. They were in control. And, but there were some things on the horizon, and which would impede the continuation of that progress. And so it's a fascinating time. It's a time in which we can actually locate the development and unfolding of processes that we normally associated with quote-unquote modernity, but they're right there. I'll have opportunity to talk about these things over the next couple of days.
But when you say Africans, it's not like, there's a concept of an African, right? I mean, people define themselves locally, and people hated each other like people all over the world hated each other and fought for resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I want to, so I'll have opportunity to talk about that perhaps a little bit. So, but just as a Professor Gates, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure about that. I do think that that to an appreciable, so certainly were conflicts and so forth, but
Wars and empires and conquering and slavery and such.
But this is an interesting thing, though, because when we get to, so Sunjata, we were talking about the epic of the stories about Sunjata, and in some ways the orature around Sunjata kind of represents a rupture in the ways in which Africans in this part of the world, at least in West Africa, approach polity and engage with their neighbors. And I think that it is definitely related to a kind of stimulation from trans-Saharan trafficking. And what we see is the rise of a kind of form of virulence in response to that traditions which focus on earlier formations simply don't have. For example, with respect to ancient Ghana, Ouagadougou, or Kayamaga, we don't have that kind of martial tradition in which kingdoms are just, you have this kind of bloodletting going on. It is something that seems to take place a little later. Now, this is speculative, and I'm engaged in hypothesis here. I think that you are definitely on target with respect to subsequent developments, certainly from the 17th century forward. But I think that at least insofar as West Africa is concerned, I'm a little less sanguine about these matters.
Well, we want Sean to ask the final question.
Yes.
And then we'll ask everyone to
Thanks, Cap.
join us for food and drink. We will debate that at dinner.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, and I'm glad you qualified. See, remember, Egypt and Nubia,
Yeah.
they fought all the time.
Yes.
Right? And
Yes.
They predated all these people.
Yes, yes. Well, okay, so Professor Gates, you're moving me into another territory, and it's up to, okay.
All right, that's fair. Go
Yes.
ahead, Sean.
Okay, so this is a question about, I guess that you talked about polypoetics, and I was thinking as a Western medievalist about the poetics of legitimation, which we find all the time, of course. You produce literature to provide political cover or backing. And I was thinking about this question about the matricide, sort of the association of Mansa Musa's matricide and the political effect of that. And one of the things it seemed you implied, maybe I misunderstood you, is when we take something like Tariq al-Fitash, so we have a much later text that you implied there's a deep tradition that's coming forward into that and that is being expressed. And I'm wondering about a counter reading, which is retrojection, that what you've got going on there is the creation of a past, to say something about a past figure, to delegitimate, which goes into these very questions about dynastic fights over dynastic legitimacy at the moment where those are being written. And also I'm interested about the kind of chiastic relationship you might have there, where you get the written source, which is supposedly pro-Islam, has a particular ideological agenda, kind of picking up and sort of, I guess, kind of taking and doing a jujitsu on the oral tradition and its own sort of trajectories to play it back against the proponents of it.
In a reversal.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very interesting approach, and it's generative. I want to think about that some more, but my sense is that that's probably not what's going on, because one of the things about the kind of succession of dynasties is that they build upon each other, and that one of the legitimizing mechanisms, especially in Tariq al-Fitash, is so Tariq al-Fitash, of all of these documents, is making the argument that Eskil Muhammad is the rightful heir. Now, he's the rightful ruler, obviously he overthrows Sunni Ali. Sunni Ali is from the region. Eskil Muhammad is Mande. He comes from the western, we'll talk about this, but he comes from the western part of the realm. He comes from an area called Tenderma. He moves into Gao on the other side of the Niger and takes over. He has no business there. So this creates a dilemma for Mahmud Kati, who is also from Tenderma. And so what he does, and and Ibn al-Mukhtar, is what they do is they create Tariq al-Fitash to make the argument that Eskil Muhammad, although he is not part of Sunni Ali's family, is in fact the rightful heir because he connects to Mali, who then connects to Ghana. This is the thread. So the point here is that the last thing they want to do is to disrupt that thread. What Tariq al-Fitash is trying to do is to connect these dynasties, which makes this matricide thing all the more interesting. I think it's a seam, because Tariq al-Fitash talks about the sources for this. The question is this: where did they get this story? Okay, if this is being completed in the 17th century, and this is something that's taking place in the 14th century, where is this information coming from? It's coming from griots. It's coming from griots. There are no written sources. So it represents in my opinion, it represents a seam in the traditions that the writers of Tariq al-Fitash sat down with a group of Jelu who didn't have, they were not enamored of Mansa Musa. So, Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.